is unit testing. This is a test, I think, for Ruby that I found on Flickr, which tests the internationalization of the word sausage to German in this case. It was referred to as the worst unit test ever. But unit testing is important, even maybe this is a bit too much, but unit testing is important because it is your first point of quality assurance. The unit tests usually are run by the developer before they even commit their code into the repository. So this is your first point where you can notice that something is wrong with your code. And they also safeguard you from unexpected side effects of changes that you make. If you think, well, I'm going to refactor this and I'm going to change this into something else, then your unit tests will be able to find out, at least if you have enough unit tests to test your code base, these unit tests will be able to find out that if your change here will affect something there. It's like the wall example that Ivo used. A bug fix here will throw down the rest of the wall. And unit tests will prevent this from happening. Well, not always, but if you use unit tests well, this will prevent this from happening. And a good mantra for this, for refactoring, is that you test first to ensure that all your tests are working correctly. Then you make your change and you test again. And if your unit tests pass before you make your change, and if they pass after you make your change, then you know, okay, my refactoring was done well because the rest of my application didn't notice my change here. When you write unit tests, one thing to notice is that you need to test not just what is expected behavior, but also to test if there is any unexpected behavior. Like if your original implementation does not throw any exceptions in any situation, then you may want to test whether your code throws exceptions. Because if your code starts throwing exceptions after a change, then that means that something was not done well. And this may be able to break your application in certain situations. Now let me go into a small, simple example of what we can do with refactoring. I'm going to use a user authentication script. This is a very simple script that everyone will probably be able to understand, even though it is in PHP. I'm going to use a test-driven approach. This means I'll write the test first, and then I'll start implementing the code. Now my test here, it is a very simple test. It's a unit test that does 3 assertions. The first one is, if I pass test as a username and test as a password, it should return true. Of course, I made this decision here that there will be a user called test with a password called test. Now the second one is, if I pass in an incorrect username with the correct password, do I get a false in return? And again, the same for if I enter a wrong password but have the right username. Now this is the most essential thing that you can do with user authentication, of course. You pass 2 parameters and you check what the result is. If it's the right username, the right password, it will result in a positive, and otherwise it will result in a negative. So my first implementation of this class, user, is that very hard-coded. If the username is test and the password is test, then it will return true, and otherwise it will return false. Now this is a very simple example, of course, and you should never hard-code usernames and passwords in your code, of course, but it is just my first version. I want this to, for instance, have a prototype running where people can log in with this test username and test password. Now if I run this unit test, then I see everything is okay. Okay. So I know now that the code that I have is actually working. The tests that I have are running correctly. Now it's time to start refactoring. I want to change the implementation of this authentication to use, well, a database, for instance. So what I do now is I still accept these two parameters, username and password, but I start selecting the information from the database and checking if the user is there and if the password is correct. And if I find it, then I know that it is a correct user and the password is correct, and I return true, and otherwise I still return false. So a thing to note here is that even though my API stays the same, because the method is the same, the class is the same, the parameters are the same, and the return values are still the same, I did change the logic inside the application. And if I run my unit tests again, I still get OK. This is, of course, in the background, I created my database, I created my table, inserted the user. But the point is, I test again, and it's OK. Now I know the change that I made in the code is refactored correctly. Now in this case, I only have one unit test, testing this class. But of course, I should have a lot of unit tests for my whole project, and they should all be run. And if everything is fine, then I'm OK. Now, some little tips and tricks on refactoring. These are things that I encountered while working on projects and trying to refactor stuff. First thing is, write your unit tests before you start refactoring. Now, this is, especially in the test-driven approach that I mentioned before, this is, well, the logical thing to do. But of course, I'm not sure how it works for you guys, but I sometimes have to work on projects with an existing code base. And I come in later, and I have to work on that. And not all the code may be covered by tests at that point. Now, if I want to refactor some of this existing code, and I find out that the code is not covered by a test yet, the first thing I need to do is just write the test to make sure that I understand what is happening there, and also to make sure that if I make some changes afterwards, it still works the same way. So even if you have existing code and it's not covered by tests, make sure that you write the tests before you start refactoring. And then you come back, of course, you make the change and test again to see if your refactoring was successful. Another thing is that code documentation may be a good friend for you in refactoring. Because in, like, let's find an example. There we go. Now, this is PHP doc up here, which documents my API. And Ivo mentioned that for a lot of languages, a similar system is available. If you need to change this documentation while you're changing your code, then you know that you're not refactoring anymore, but you're rewriting, because you're changing something to your API. It may be that you put a parameter in a different order, or changing something, or it may be that your return value changes, or even that you throw an exception that you might not have thrown before. Then you know that your behavior will be changing. And again, this is not a problem if it is required for the change that you're doing, but you need to be conscious then that if you change this unit's functionality or behavior, that all the code that is calling this may be able to break later on. And the same also goes for unit tests, because if I have to change something in my unit test to reflect a change in my code, then I know I'm not refactoring anymore. One last other thing for this is that you should not fully trust on the refactoring options that most I have. They may be working well, but they may not be working well always. I found that out the hard way. So use them, but make sure that you check afterwards if everything went correctly. So will you refactor now? Anyone refactoring? Don't be shy. Very good.